My name is Terrence Musekiwa. I live in Zimbabwe and England. I'm an artist working in stone, mixed media, antique objects. I grew up in a family of sculpting. My father is a second generation sculptor in Zimbabwe, Kennedy Musekiwa. I went to the School of Visual Art Studios in Zimbabwe, where it is at the National Art Gallery of Zimbabwe. Then I went to an art collective called Zimbabwe Art Interaction. That's when I started learning more about my art after learning it from my father's side. By having a chance of making sculptures and borrowing the history from the past, from the generation which started working, and when the sculpture of Zimbabwe was being dated from the 11th century, from the Great Zimbabwe, from the Zimbabwe beds, all those kind of artifacts. I borrowed a lot to them by the sculpting side, because Zimbabwe, it's called Zimbabwe, which is the house of stones. And it's called Great Zimbabwe because it was made by stones without mortars. So by giving a chance of knowing that kind of knowledge, it gives me access to start sculpting only stone and start finding other kind of objects which I can use, which were made before I was born, before the independence of Zimbabwe. I found materials which dated from 1900 to 1970, and some of them, they end up being materials from the independence. I chose the phones because they were used in Zimbabwe. But after the introductions of the cell phones, the phones were phased out. So I went to an auction, then I found tons of those rotary phones and those phone booth phones. Then I could not know how to use it. But knowing that this material was made before us when we were born, I thought there were people using it. Then I researched more about that. Then I saw the only people who were able to use the old phones and the phones, they were people from the government. So I created sculptures, metaphorically, talk about the government workers. I always try to continue working. I work with miniature small sculptures. So this is one of the big standing sculptures that I'm working on, which I worked on until now. I borrow history from my African side. The people from Namibia, the Himba and the Herero people, they have their own god, which is called Mukuru. So by having a chance of knowing that kind of history and spiritual history, that god is the god of creation. So I decided to come with an idea of how can I create a piece of artwork which can be both economically, politically, and spiritually, with all the materials which I can find. Then I made the stone head in Zimbabwe, 2015. So the head was still in Zimbabwe. Then I created the whole body when I came to England, 2020. Then during the pandemic, then I started constructing the whole piece. But the whole piece was lacking the idea of the top part. So I went back to Zimbabwe. I collected the head back. Then I come here with the head. Then I put it all together. Then all these artworks, I have to find it here in England. So I brought two cultures, two history, the European side history and the African side history of the head, which almost resemble the hard drive. So this is more just a concept which I thought of. How can I go back to the earth, and how can I talk about the earth? Then I choose the internet cable, which is more the contemporary way of communicating through space. Then this internet cable, they are made with copper. So copper is a mineral which was found in Africa centuries ago. So, but now this copper is here in the West, and the West is using copper as a means of communicating, and they are phasing away these internet cables. So by choosing these all internet cables and electric cables, it reminds me of the flow of the energy from the natural ground to the people. And that's how I feel like this artwork was like. So all those kind of purposes of it's more part of my inspiration. And being an African itself, it's part of, the inspiration which you can't rub it away from yourself. And borrowing that knowledge and bring it into the West where some other people don't have access to go to the African continent. By me coming to the West, it gives them ideas of, of how Africa is, what kind of knowledge do Africa have through me.